week, and as time permits, we'll be going a couple places tonight as we continue talking about the times and the seasons. Really, I guess is one way you could say it. Look at Acts and chapter 17, and verse 26 is the focal verse that we're using here, but let's back up and read the whole context, beginning verse 22. So Paul, standing in the midst of the Areopagus, said, "Men of Athens, I perceive that in every way you're very religious." By the way, look this way for a second. I read a report just today that says America is still an extremely religious nation. But now that's the terminology it used, that America is still an extremely religious nation. It said 7 out of 10 people still claim some kind of religious affiliation. Now, that sounds like a lot, and I guess it is. That's what, 70%, but that's still significantly down from 10 years ago when it was upwards of 80%. At any rate, the article, using several Pew reports, Gallup reports, and other, went on to say that America, though it may not be Orthodox Christianity anymore, it is still a very religious nation. Well, that Paul's dealing with people that were very religious. And I would say to you that if you want to understand the culture we're living in, go back and study the first century culture when the church was young and had been birthed. It was the culture, the things they were battling with have come full circle. And it's identical to what we're battling with. I'll show you that again as time permits. Okay, so we carry on verse 23. "For as I passed along and observed the objects of your worship, I found also an altar with the inscription to the unknown God. What therefore you worship as unknown, this I proclaim to you." And get this picture in your mind, if you will. The Parthenon is sitting up on this hill, and right below it is a little area where these philosophers and religious philosophers would come and gather, and it was kind of like a bunch of old men going to parties and having coffee together and talking things over. And they would all gather there, but they were considered the kind of teachers and the leaders of the philosophical ideas. And Athens, in particular, Greece, was kind of looked at as the intellects of their day. Rome conquered Greece, but culturally, Greece conquered Rome. Does that make sense? Militarily, Rome conquered, but the culture of the Greeks was incorporated into the Roman Empire. But they would come and they would sit in this place. I've been there on a few occasions where they were, and they had these gods. They were incredibly paranoid. They were afraid they'd leave a god out. And so they had all of these different idols to every kind of conceivable god of their age. And they were so paranoid they had one to the unknown God. That was to cover their bases. In other words, so if we miss one, here he is, the unknown God. So Paul piggybacks off of that, and he says, "Hey, I see you're very religious. You got an idol to the unknown God." He said, "Let me tell you who that unknown God is. That I'll talk to you about him. Let me tell you." And Paul goes on, of course, to tell them that he is God of all gods. And he says, "A God who made the world and everything in it, being Lord of heaven and earth, does not live in temples made by a man, nor is he served by human hands as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all mankind life and breath and everything." Now here's our focal verse. Now watch this. "And he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth," on all the entire globe. "Having determined," this is an operative phrase, "having determined allotted periods," that would be historical duration. "Having determined allotted periods and the boundaries of their dwelling place, that they should seek God in hope that they might feel their way toward him and find him. Yet actually, he's not far away from all of us." And he goes on to do a little more relation in terms of his conversation philosophically to them. He could speak with them. Paul was a highly educated man. But he says that operative phrase as he's talking to them about the Jehovah God. He says he is God of all gods. And it is he that created everything. It is he that established the boundaries of the nations and their time span. Their time span. Now, I know this probably in this age we're living doesn't come as much of a shock to us as it might have, 50 years ago. But the fact is, America will not exist forever. Can you wrap your mind around that? No empire has ever existed forever. The greatest empires in history have eventually collapsed or gone away with. I'll talk to you about that as well. So it's important to understand, because of what we're talking about, we tend to think, well, we're America. And because we're America, we'll just go on and on and on. But what you are seeing in America now causes you to take a little pause, right? Because you see the seeds of our own ruin being planted. Well, they were planted a long time ago. Now we're seeing the crop. And so if you read your Bible and study your Bible, then you realize that, yes, indeed, the clock is running down. Now, I've told you this many times. I don't know when the clock is going to finish. But the clock will finish at some point in time. Or should I say, the clock will stop at some point in time, because God has appointed the boundaries. And God has a plan that he is working. And that plan affects the globe. It affects the nations, the individuals. And so the day is coming. The scripture also says he has fixed the seasons. He has fixed. Listen to this. There is already a fixed date for the return of Christ. Did you know that? Now, you don't know what that date is, but God has already fixed the date. It is out there. Now, people ask me, does that mean that can't fluctuate? I don't know. You'll have to ask him. I do believe this, that you and I make choices that within his permissive will have an impact. God has, look, you say, well, that's hard to understand. Yeah, it is. That's why you and I aren't God. It's not hard for God to understand. It all works perfectly in his sovereign will. But within his sovereign will, he's allowed us to make a difference between now and the ultimate consummation of the age. But you can read the Bible and you can see that the age is playing out exactly as the scripture says. I was reading today in the book of Revelation, and I got to thinking about the 7 seals that are broken during the tribulation. And it says, in chapter 6, in verse 8, and I looked, and behold, a pale horse. And the rider's name was Death, and Hades followed him. And they were given authority over a fourth of the earth to kill with the sword, and with famine, and with pestilence, and by wild beasts of the earth. Now, we might have thought, well, some of those things occur, but do you realize just in the last couple of years, all of those things have manifested? You say, well, famine? Well, I'm glad you asked about that. This article, a news article I read just today, food shortages, highest prices set to hit some countries hard. Now, I won't read the article to you, but that's the fourth article I've read in a week talking about prepare for the coming food shortages. In fact, listen to this. Our president recently admitted that food shortages are going to be real. Now, y'all probably heard that, right? Did y'all hear that? Did y'all know that? He said that in, um, uh, and then he added, and he used the word, listen, famine to describe what is coming. He used the word famine. They didn't put the word in his mouth. Now, they may have wanted him to back off. They have had a penchant to need to do that. But famine coming. It's been reported that food prices at German supermarkets will go up between 20 and 50% here very soon. Rationing has already begun in Spain. The French Prime Minister has come out and said we need to all be prepared for what's coming in terms of food shortages. Now, the article I first mentioned to you said regarding the looming threat of food scarcity, U.S. President Joe Biden announced March 24th it's going to be real, and said that the United States and Canada may need to increase production to avoid shortages in Europe and other places that are already struggling with food security. It said while the United States is unlikely to see any significant shortages, but that's just speculation, what the U.S. is going to see is increasing inflation in regards to food. Well, that's already started. I mean, have you seen a difference in your grocery bill? I told my wife one of us is going to have to quit eating, and I'm not. But in all seriousness, so there's some of those kind of. My point is, I don't believe we're in the tribulation. But my point is, you can see how these things converge. And so, again, if you go over to Matthew chapter 24, you see it talking about the same things. And by the way, when the Bible uses the word pestilence, that is another word for pandemic, disease, sickness by disease, that sort of thing. So you're living in some interesting days. The clock will run out. That's what the writer of Acts, Luke, Dr. Luke, when he's talking about this, recording this conversation that Paul had on the Areopagus, Paul's saying, look, there are fixed times. God has fixed times, and those times are fixed for nations. Now, again, someday maybe we'll have the discussion about can the boundaries move a little bit, and I think they can. I think Nineveh is an example of that. But it doesn't look like anything's happening right now to change it, does it? So there's going to be upheaval with nations and those sorts of things, as we've talked about on many occasions. But here's what we tend to do. We tend to do what this article said, and that is we go, but it can't happen here. Yes, we could see it happening somewhere else. By the way, the Ukraine, I've been to Romania and some of the Eastern European countries, and there are a cluster of them that are considered the breadbasket of Europe. In other words, they produce, Russia produces gas, Ukraine produces wheat and food and grains, and that supply a major segment of Europe with the grains that they need to survive. But we tend to take the approach, and we're all hopeful that it's true that the shortages won't show up quite in America like in other places. Why? Because we say, yeah, all of that stuff that happens, but it can't happen in our country. Our country is different. That's kind of the common belief of many. But the reality is, and history proves, that nations are born and die just like individuals do. And the life of a nation or an empire may exceed the average person's lifespan, but the reality is that nations also die. So a nation, it may not die in your lifespan, but it will die in somebody's lifespan. And the average, would you hazard to guess what the average duration of the great empires of the world have been? 200 years. 200 years. Do you know which one exceeded that, which kind of skews it, which means most of the others were much less? Do you know who skews it? Rome. Rome lasted for 500 years as an empire, though you could argue for the last 200 years, it was in a state of turmoil. By the way, those who've studied that, Dr. Francis Schaeffer, Edward Gibbons, in his 3 volumes, if you really want to read that, it's lengthy. He has an abridgment too you could read, The Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire. When you read that, just from a historical perspective, America is already where Rome was when Rome collapsed 500 years in. And we're just, 200 and something years old? So the average lifespan has been about 200, but we have a tendency, and I want to be optimistic. So I want to say, we'll get it figured out. We'll turn our hearts back toward God, and God will move. And I actually believe that the only hope that we have is a movement of God. There's nothing in the culture that causes you to go, oh, yeah, we're starting to turn this thing back around. There's nothing there. Read my column again this week, if you will. Hang on just a second, Robert. Read my column again, if you will, this week. I pull some quotes out of an article by a friend of mine, Dr. Albert Mohler. We went to school together, and he really made something in his life. But I had a conversation with a group of pastors on a Zoom call with him recently, and he said he's very in tune to culture and what's happening and how that shapes things. And he said, where America is, it cannot survive. It will not survive. The transgender stuff is just bizarrely out of control. You know, it's just when a Supreme Court nominee cannot define a woman. And, we're told, and I write about this in the column, we're told to follow the science. Have y'all heard that for the last 2 years? Follow the science. Follow the science. Follow the science. Well, science is fixed. There are laws that govern science, and those laws can't really, you may not like them, but you don't violate them because they're fixed. They're empirical laws. And by the way, gender, male and female gender, is biological. Do you know what pandemic science is? It's biological, right? It's about the body, and it's about vaccines, and I'm not against any vaccine. Go get your vaccine, or whatever. That's not even my point. My point is, we're told, are y'all following where I'm going? We're told to follow the science about the pandemic. So if you had a problem with something, you say, well, follow the science. Follow the science. Is that a man or a woman? Follow the science. No, we don't follow biological science on that. We just toss that one because it doesn't fit a narrative that we want to advance. We just throw out biology there. But when it comes to virus, you've got to pay attention to the biology. Y'all see what I'm saying? A nation cannot survive that way. Cannot survive that way. So, and by the way, the day will come when what I'm saying will get me in trouble. I've said it a bunch of years. I've seen this coming. The day likely will come when what I'm saying will get me in trouble and even get me arrested. Now, when it happens, if it does, and I'm not looking for it, no, I don't want it, I'm not going to try, so just know that. Somebody's told me, Pastor, we will come and visit you, the jail. I want to say it as I've said it clearly for the past 21 years. Don't come and visit me. Get me out. All right? Just so, but do you understand, this is where it's going. This is where it's going. And now we're not being told you have to tolerate this kind of bizarre stuff. Now we're being told you have to stand up and affirm it. And so we say America can't collapse. Dear friends, Rome got where we are with the perversities of its culture and collapsed. And you know who overtook them? The barbarians. In that the intellectual culture was conquered by the unintellectual, the guys that had big clubs. That's the bottom line, right? And so we say it can't happen here. I would suggest to you it is happening here. Not that it can't, it is happening here. And by the way, I believe there's a bigger agenda going on. Y'all reading your newspapers and your news sources and everything? The real reset is coming. I talked to you a little bit about Klaus Schwab and the World Economic Forum, and just this past week there were a group of them that were in part sponsored by an American conglomerate organization along with the World Economic Forum, and they had a little summit once again in Dubai. And in that meeting, I can't read you all this, but in that meeting, Klaus Schwab got up and talked about the new reset is coming, and the pandemic has been the key to ushering it in. And at this meeting, just this past week, they discussed that there is the need for the new world order. Our own president said the new world, this is an opportunity to reset to a new world order. Do you know what the new world order, and they make no bones about it at the meeting, the new world order, you know what it's about? It's about forming a one world government and economic system. Wow, where have I read about that before? You see, I'm not being dramatic. I'm being forthright. And the Lord told me years ago, He whispered to my heart, and you be careful when you say the Lord told me. Sometimes it was just bad pizza. But He whispered to my heart and said, you get my people ready. If you've been here for any length of time, you know that a lot of the focus of my preaching and everything is to equip you and prepare you for what's ahead. And you say, I don't know how good a job I'm doing. Maybe you folks on Wednesday night will be prepared. You know. So, but at any rate, it can happen here. Yes, I think it is happening here. I don't think this is something that's yet. I think it's happening. Now, Jesus talked about birth pains. And He said, the end is not yet. In Matthew 24, you go look. And sometimes it's been mispreached. It's been preached like, oh, the birth pains are the end. No, Jesus said that these are birth pains, but the end is not yet. These are the precursors to the end. I believe we are seeing the birth pains. Now, I haven't always said that. I've said the birth pains are coming, but we've always had wars and that sort of stuff. But the convergence of everything and the shift toward thinking about a world reset and people, I believe that we are seeing the birth pains. Now, how far into that? I don't know, but we've all learned something very, very significant in the last 2 years. Things can change just like that. You know, they're already talking about the next wave of COVID. Did y'all know that? By the way, from what I've read, it's my understanding that pandemics become endemics exactly like this one is doing. That different strands continue, but they get weaker and less dominant and less dangerous. So another one will come, but it's not quite as bad, and then another one comes, it's not quite as bad, and then another one comes, it's not quite as bad, and that sort of stuff, until essentially the virus is just, you you may get the virus, okay? But, you can live with it and the herd immunity and all of these kinds of things. That is, according to a couple of doctors I've read who said this is exactly the way it plays out. But you would not know that if you listen to what's being said out there. And that is, I firmly believe, because nothing has ever, in my lifetime, nothing has ever controlled the American population like this. Where you notice our elected officials go all over the place. They don't wear a mask. You see our vice president in Washington, D.C. school this week? Surrounded by kids with masks on. She had nothing on. I ought to rephrase that. She had no mask on. Never mind. But look, nothing has controlled the American population, who prides itself in one of its most cherished ideas, freedom. But nothing has restricted the American freedom and controlled them and caused them to have to say, government, tell us what to do, like the last 2 years. I believe that's a precursor to getting us ready for somebody that can stand up and say, this is what we have to do to keep everything in line. Now, I don't think the pandemic was started for that reason. I just think it was capitalized on. Does that make sense? And if anybody knows that it's real, I do. I've had it twice. And so I don't deny the reality of it. But you've heard the old line, never let a good crisis go to waste. And I heard a politician use that line again recently as it regarded COVID. I still ain't got to my first point. Y'all got it? So let me give you 3 precepts from this one verse. I won't give them all to you tonight. But the first is this: I want you to note the nation's God created existence. And he made from one man every nation, it says. Verse 26, that's where I am. It's a statement about origins. And by the way, let me just give you something else, a little bit of additional theology. There are many today who say that the story of Adam and Eve were just a myth. I went to a Southern Baptist university, and I had a professor who taught that Adam and Eve weren't real people, that they were a myth. It was just the best way that we knew how to explain how we got here. I questioned that, and I lost favor with the professor. I questioned. I'd been discipled in the Scripture, and I thought, I've never heard anything like that. And I said, are you saying they're not real? And he said, well, most scholars believe. And then he gave me what I came to finally understand, the Wellhausen theory and the higher critical methodologies, and so the JPD and all theories and everything. But he said, yes, he said, that's how scholars. And that's the way sometimes, you get around it, you dodge it. You say, who are you? You're a lowly student asking me. And I was asking because I thought, well, gosh, surely everybody believes that Adam and Eve were real. I still do. And I'm in good company, because so did the Apostle Paul. Because, how do I know? Did you see the statement? Look at it again. And he made from one man every nation. Who would the one man be, class? Every nation descended from that one man. So it is a statement. That's not even about eschatology. That's just free. All nations exist because God ordained it. And their origin goes all the way back to Adam. And then, subsequently, the Tower of Babel, where God dispersed the people, changed their languages, and established groups of people all over the earth. That's why you got nations. And that's how they came from one man. Does that make sense? Okay, and so that's what he says right here. All nations are created by God, and they are created for God. I didn't just say all nations serve God. But in the purpose of their creation, it was to serve God. All nations have become corrupt and contaminated, including America. America is not even remotely close to where we originated. Not even close. But all nations were created. And by the way, the further a nation gets from God, the further away they get from His blessing. You can see it in America. We'll look at Romans probably next week. We'll look at Romans, but professing themselves to be wise, they became fools. And so how do we know the purpose in creation? Well, in Colossians 1 and verse 17, Paul says this, and He, God, is before all things, and in Him all things hold together. He is before all things, and in Him all things hold together. You do realize, again, He's working a sovereign plan, but if He wanted to, He could say, I'm just removing myself, and the laws of the universe would disband. God could say, I'm tired of holding it all together. I'm stepping away. Y'all have heard the old song, From a Distance? Have y'all heard that song before? Bette Midler made that song popular. People think that's such a beautiful spiritual song. It is catchy, isn't it? You know what that song is? That ought to be the deist national anthem. A deist is a person who believes that God exists and God created, but after He created, He just kind of threw it out in the universe and He stepped away and said, you're on your own. Now, by the way, it looks like we're on our own, doesn't it? That's a deist. So from a distance, God is watching. From a distance, there's no war. From a distance, everybody loves each other. All of this sort of stuff. But I'm not involved. My hands are off. It's up to you. That's a deist point of view. Look, if God backed off, everything would go to smithereens. All the laws would change. He is before all things, and in Him all things hold together. Most historians, honest historians I should say, that admit that America's founding purpose and existence was a result of the providence of God in its formation and in its mission. I don't know how much. You want to read some good books on America's founding and history? Go read David Manuel and that other guy. David Manuel, get The Light and the Glory, From Sea to Shining Sea. And it reads like a novel, but it's history. And they're fabulous. I just recommended them to a mom who has older kids and say, I want to read something about America's origins, and so this is fabulous stuff. But honest historians admit that our founders, though they weren't all thoroughly born-again Christians, they all agreed in the deity of God, that the laws of nature were derived from the law of God, and that the law of government was to be derived from the laws of God. That's the Scripture. That's the Old Testament laws. We have a speed limit law. I'm going to do my best not to break it tomorrow. I shouldn't say I'll do my best, but I'm going to Nashville. And they'll have those signs posted all along the road, 85 or 90. Isn't that what it is? I don't drive with my glasses, so that 6 and 6.5, it sometimes throws me off. But do you know why we have speed limits? You ever heard somebody say you can't legislate morality? Liberals love to use that. That is absolutely, let me use a Greek word, stupid. Did you know every law that you have is legislated morality? It may not be the right kind of morality, but it is legislated morality. It is this is a law. You can't violate this. This is a law. So why do we have a speed limit? And how could that possibly come from the laws of God? We have speed limits because we believe that human life is valuable. Are y'all with me? And if human life is valuable, what must we do, class? Protect it. Okay, why? Why would we protect human life? Because it's valuable. Why is human life valuable? Because God said, thou shalt not murder. Why did God say you shall not murder? Because human life is valuable. You see, now you know why you can only drive a certain speed. Right? Well, my point is that our nation originated, and even its laws were derived from a higher law, the law of God. Ronald Reagan, he said this, I have always believed that this anointed land was set apart in an uncommon way, that a divine plan placed this great continent here between the oceans to be found by people from every corner of the earth who had a special love for faith and freedom. You get, to paraphrase, Reagan said, I've always believed that God created this nation. It was His providence that this nation should come into existence. Well, that's what Paul says. In fact, the truth is that's true about all nations. But we're really still a pup against the other nation. We're babes nationally. You do know that. I mean, you can go to Europe and you can go to cities. I've been in. Well, I can remember on a couple of times of going to Rome and touring just Rome, and there are buildings in Rome where people are still conducting business, shops, where people sell clothes and all kinds of stuff. And those buildings that they're in are older than our nation. Think about this. Those buildings were there before we ever existed, before Columbus and those who would follow him ever got to the shores of America. Those buildings were there. Now, they weren't selling designer clothes at the time, but you understand, when you can look at a building and say, that building was here before our nation existed. That's a pretty sobering thought, because then you realize we really are pretty young in the grand scheme of history. I've got to stop here, but the truth is that every nation exists because God created it. Now you say, what in the world? I thought we were talking about, you got to hang on with me, okay? I'll be back next Wednesday with reports on the grandkids, but we'll continue this because this is a part of understanding what's going on. And if we continue this study, I'm going to talk about in later sessions the rise of the Antichrist, and I'm going to show you some things about the Antichrist and tribulation and specific things like that. But I did at least give you the first thing, that to remember that the nations were created to exist by God. I'll go ahead and tell you the next thing I'm going to start talking to you about, and that is that God has allowed a nation's expansion. God allows that. A nation doesn't expand either way if God doesn't allow it. And the passage there says, and the boundaries. That's the operative phrase. That means that God determines what the expansion of a nation is. And a nation will never become larger than God allows. Okay? All right. What questions do you have? Any questions tonight? Oh, Robert, that's right. You had a question a minute ago. I silenced you. Yeah. That's a good question. For those of you who are watching us by live stream, let me repeat the question. Robert asked, he says, America is still the number one exporter of the gospel. And will God allow it because of that to continue to exist until that mission is fulfilled? And my answer is, I don't know. There are other nations, it might surprise you, there are other nations that are distributing the gospel now, maybe almost as much as America. I had a couple of, some of you remember, was it last year, year before last, an organization that I heretofore did not know existed, made up of over 500,000 pastors around the globe, CLF. And they're conservative, but they're based out of Korea, I believe it is, but their network of these pastors is all over the globe. And they have a big conference every year. In fact, 2 of their representatives came to visit me last week. I did something for them. I did a session for them, and I must have not laid an egg because they've asked me, would I fly to New York in 2 weeks and do another session? And I can't. But my point is, it's amazing. They're getting the gospel out, and they're based out of Asia, and they're getting the gospel out to these pastors. Wow. I was stunned when they told me the expanse of their network. So, Robert, I think it may be, two things. I think the origin of our nation was providential by God. George Washington believed it too. Was providential by God so that we could be a free enough nation to be able to take the gospel anywhere. And I think for a good chunk of our history, we have been faithful with that. Nobody has sent more missionaries out than the U.S., and that is still true. So I think that has caused God to favor us on some level. The other thing is, we were the initial, it was Truman. If it hadn't been for Truman stepping up, even though our own leaders, his own cabinet leaders told him not to support Israel to become a nation, he did it anyway. And I think our support of Israel has been instrumental in God allowing us to continue. There are subtleties behind the scenes that would remove our connection. You watch, just pay attention, and you'll see efforts to try to distance us from Israel. The war in Ezekiel 38 and 39, America will not do a thing, but just say, don't, or we're going to send them some weapons or something, but America won't. Why? We don't have time. I think there are some reasons. So my point is, America, I think, has had the favor of God for so long. I don't think we're under God's favor right now. I think we're under God's allowance. And we've had that favor because we have distributed the gospel. We were founded, the Pilgrims called us a city on a hill, like the Jesus about the candle on a hill. And then because we have been a